Hello and welcome to another edition of Legacy, a video series produced by Columbia Yacht Club's Communication Committee. I'm Perry Weinberg. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have Reese Elledge with us today, a member for over 50 years and a former two-time Commodore. Reese was absolutely the right person at the right time when Columbia and the Abegweit needed help. So put on your favorite PFD and join us on this voyage of discovery as we learn how decades-old challenges have created the strong and magnificent club ship we call home. So today we're going to start, I guess, at day one. When you arrived in Chicago, you came to Chicago to go to law school. You hadn't been a sailor yet. Tell us about that arrival and when was that and where'd you go?
After I graduated and after I got the job, I was hanging out with a group of friends, drinking friends. Yeah. Mostly at Jimmy's Woodland Tap. One of the members of that group was a member of Youth Hostel International. Okay. And Youth Hostel International had a group of Rhodes 19s moored down in the south end of Monroe Harbor, and it was available for members and for guests. And I was taken out for my first introduction to sailing on Lake Michigan by one of those friends, and I took to it. I liked it a lot. And I liked the Rhodes 19, which is the boat they were using, and I was perfectly happy to row the dinghies that they had on the dock out to them. At some point, not too long after I graduated, two other guys and I decided to buy a sailboat. And the boat we bought was not a Rhodes 19. It was an O'Day Mariner, which is a variant on the Rhodes 19, same hull, but it had a cuddy, and the rig was different. The mast was deck mounted, but other than that, she sailed like a Rhodes 19. So once we bought that, we knew it would be very helpful to be a member of a yacht club. And the graduate students and I didn't see Chicago Yacht Club as being the place we wanted to be, but Columbia looked like a good place to drink at. I joined in '71. Okay. And I got involved almost immediately in the activities committee, which was chaired by Howard Beers, and that was a fun group to be in. The best part of the year is when the activities committee decorated for Christmas. Oh, yeah. We didn't have staff do it; we did it, and the club provided the drinks, as it were. Yeah. The other connection I made in the club pretty quickly was with the penguin fleets. I don't see any penguins on our dock anymore, but at that time it was a substantial fleet of sailing dinghies, tippy, a difficult boat to sail well. It was not that hard to sail, but the problem was, among other things, it was an open dinghy. It was tippy. The original first hull number one, I think, was named Flywheel, and that was an apt first name for that boat. It was not self-righting. And so people periodically dumped it, including me. Wow. But it was a good group that raced on Sundays. And a member of the fleet would be would volunteer once every while to operate a crash boat so that we could go over and pick people out of the water when they dumped.
Could you rate it when it was?
We could, you really couldn't.
Yeah.
You really couldn't. You had to tow her, you had to get her out of the water. First of all, you had to get the person out of the water and get her on her side.
Yeah.
But the taxi service then was run by the Eldine brothers, and the Eldines would come and pick up whichever boat it was that had dumped and would bring it over to the dock for us. It was a courtesy. You were expected to give the whoever was on the taxi a six-pack.
Oh.
And that was the quid pro quo, as it were.
Tradition carries on.
Yeah, that was the tradition. The races were run by a member of this club called Thor Christensen. Nice man, a longtime member of this club who had a Rhodes 19, and he used that to set the line, to set the course, and do starts and finishes. The racing was in Monroe Harbor, and he would be there with his wife, Charlotte, who was blind, and Thor would give her a blow-by-blow of everything that was going on. Without him, it would be hard to keep the fleet together, I think. But there was a big group. Had to be at least 15 or 20 penguins on the dock. Their races were on Sundays.
So this was on the dock of the Florida?
Initially on the dock of the Florida, and when we built this dock, we would have them out here too.
Some of the greatest legends at Columbia involve the heroic efforts of hundreds of members who worked tirelessly during turbulent times associated with a number of events while they were on the board, one of which was the straightening of the S-curve. If you can describe what it was like beforehand, and then what was the challenge of straightening the S-curve?
Okay, well, those of you who've been around in Chicago for a long time will remember that the outer drive going north from the Field Museum went straight until it hit the river. And there was a 90-degree turn to the right there that went for a block and a half, maybe 2 blocks, to line up with the existing bridge, where there was another 90-degree turn to the left to continue forth to the north over the river. There were a lot of accidents there, and there were more than a few fatalities. And the city decided to get rid of the 2 right-angle turns. And to do that, they would have to change the configuration of the harbor, to move it over so that there could be 2 gentle curves leading up to where the bridge was. This meant filling in, among other things, the old armory, tearing down the old armory, and to start the curve of the harbor right north of Chicago Yacht Club. The club ship was moored, the Florida was moored, and our docks were between Chicago Yacht Club, where it is now, and what a large stone building, which was the Illinois Armory, Naval Armory, I believe.
Yeah.
And so that would mean, to get out there, that we were going to be filled in, and our docks were being taken away. That was pretty much a crisis, and continued to be a crisis for a good 10 years anyway. I joined the club in 1971. I've gone on the board in 1975.
Okay.
was on the board thereafter for 20 years with one break in the middle. But the things were starting to pop in terms of the relocation of the outer drive. And we had been in the Florida since the mid-30s.
Right.
And it tied up to a dock that was there, which we considered our own dock, which we had the use of as long as we maintained ourselves as a yacht club. But the first year I was on the board, we received official notice from the state of Illinois Department of Highways that they were going to fill in, and among other things, fill in over where our docks were. And the docks would be gone. They weren't going to take our club ship, but they were going to take away the docks. At that point, Howard Beers, as Commodore, established a long-range planning committee with Chester Kutner as his chairman. But the first job of the long-range planning committee was to establish a program for how are we going to deal with having the loss of our site. And that was Chester Kutner's committee. There were at least a dozen people on it. There were two functions there. One was that for sure this was going to be more than a 1 or 2 year project. And we change, of course, leadership every couple of years. So continuity for the project seemed to be a serious thing. And the establishing of goals was delegated to that committee and then presented to the board of directors, listing some of the things that absolutely were essential for us to continue. One was we were not going to close our doors. We were not going to just go away. We wanted to stay in the harbor with docks in the harbor. We wanted it to be Monroe Harbor. We needed to have compensation for the docks that they were taken away from us. The first job was to establish our goals. Okay. The second job was to hire an attorney, which was Bob Wiss. And the third was to figure out how we were going to pay for a new dock. Wow. Since this was a condemnation matter, we were able to put in a pretty strong case, mostly because Bob Wiss out-lawyered the city's lawyers, or the state's lawyers. We were dealing with various departments of several different governments. And that was also one of the functions of that committee.
Sure. Was the dock that we walk up on now to the Columbia, was that around at the time, or it was deemed inadequate?
At that point, the turning basin was separated from Monroe Harbor by the dock that we walk out now, the wall that we walk out now. Yeah. And so that we wanted to be our entry point. We wanted to be up here in this neck, and since they were going to be filling in from really Chicago Yacht Club, which remarkably enough were not affected, to coming all the way over to the sanitary district wall, which was here, and that's where we wound up, and with some serious negotiating going on. The dock that we wanted to build would have to have a different configuration. Alan Teskey was the brains behind that design. The actual design work was done by Klein and Hoffman, an engineering firm here in Chicago, a partner of whom was a member of this club.
This dock was for the Florida.
This dock was to be a replacement for mooring our club ship, and also all the floating docks that we had as dinghy docks over at the Florida. To the north of Florida, there were floating docks, or there were finger docks, and a floating platform where the sailing dinghies lived. So we needed that function to be transferred over. The engineers were Klein and Hoffman.
Okay.
The construction company was Thatcher Marine.
Okay.
The person in the club who was responsible for getting those docks built was Rick Lipsick, who is still an honorary member, I believe, and was at that time Vice Commodore.
And that dock was to be built from the turning basin wall straight out with that curve that we have today, but there wasn't the gap that we know today. So it was a north-south dock.
That's correct.
And a solid dock from one end to the other.
It was a wall. It
Wall.
was a wall.
Okay.
We wanted wooden docks that would more or less follow the curve that they were building in with the new ship line, with the new harbor line. And so that's where we presented first to the Park District and then to the City of Chicago Engineering Department. And
it explains the B and C dock at the end.
The B and C were at the end to replace the finger docks that we had over there. And the two clusters that you'll see out there between the dock and the harbor line, big clusters of wooden pilings, were to be the mooring point for Florida. And so when the time came, when we were moved, we had by that time already built the docks, and we were ready to have the Florida towed over, which the city paid for. The problem was ultimately that Florida was very well protected where she had been. We thought that by having this dock here, she would be equally protected. Not so. And it soon became clear that Florida would sink if left the way we had her tied up.
And she was deteriorating?
Florida was a very old boat. Yeah. Originally, it was a tour boat. It was built in Detroit, wrought iron. She had a rust line at the water line, and the rust line was, there was a structural problem there. With a stout pencil, you could poke a hole.
Oh wow! So you were on the board when the discussion...
I was on the board at that time because this all happened after 75, and I was on the Long Range Plan Committee. Just to name some very old names and to recognize them, Chester Kutner was chairman. Don Wildman was a significant member. Alan Teskey was a significant member. Lee Marsh was a significant member. These are all people who mostly knew their way around dealing with municipal governments.
So who broached the topic we need to replace this thing or figure out some way to fix it. That was Bob?
Well, no, that was one of our first things. We want to be in the harbor. We need to have a new dock. You're taking our old docks, so there is a procedure for moving, particularly highways, and that's the quick take procedure. And before the government can take the land, it must, if it's a quick take procedure, it has to put up money in escrow for the compensation that will be given ultimately when the property is turned back over.
So the Florida is in less than good shape, and there's two schools of thought in the club membership. Let's do what we can to fix it up, or let's shop for a replacement.
Replacing the Florida with a barge comparable to the one that Chicago Yacht Club has at Belmont. Mm-hmm. There were those who thought that one or another of the breakbulk ferries mm-hmm. that went across the lake, halfway up the lake, sure. would be a good replacement. There were some that were completely out of the question, including one that would have been perfect, which was in the Adriatic Sea. But so that was, there was a wide range of. Abby came up when John Stovall and or Juddy Goldwyn spotted them that the Abbey was for sale, the Abegweit. Mm-hmm. She was being sold by Canadian National Marine because although she was great for the job she was built for, which was as an icebreaker. Yes. To try to get through, to keep continual contact between the Canadian shore and Prince Edward Island. Right. A couple of people went out and looked at her, including, in fact, I think I was one of those guys. But Al Henning was the Commodore, and Hal Henning was the one who really took charge. And that was the presentation of, first to the board, was not without its disputes. Eli Levine, who was on the board, and a dear friend of mine, Eli and I never voted the same way on any issue. Except on the Abbey, we both voted against her.
Oh, you did?
And yes, and after that meeting, Eli pointed out that since one of us was always wrong, if we agreed, we were both wrong. So, what can I say?
What was your preference?
My preference was a barge.
Okay.
And none of the other boats that we looked at really did the job.
Sure.
So there was the presentation made to the club for a major purchase that we were going to have to replace Florida, because it was no secret Florida was going to sink.
Yes.
And we needed to get rid of her, and Jerry Lagerquist handled the sale of Florida to a guy who ran a restaurant on the North Shore. One of the questions had to be, could we afford to buy Abby? And there was a bond issue passed in order to have the cash to do it. We bought her for, as I remember, and my memory is frequently faulty on dollars, I think we paid $127,000 for her.
Okay.
And we took the responsibility for driving her down. We started out with the notion that we could tow her with towboats from Prince Edward Island. We were. It was pointed out to us that that was probably not, the guy who was giving us a good price was not capable of doing the job. So there was a lot of things going on here. But bringing her down, hiring the old captain and the existing captain, the engineer, the electrician, the pros who had been operating her for 20 years, we agreed to come along with us. We also had a number of people who were members of the club who were former merchant marine officers. So we had a couple of, there was a class of one merchant marine class that provided at least 4 officers. So, and it was and with the rest, of course, was all members. I did not go. It was not, I couldn't get the time off of work.
Sure.
And, but there is a plaque which is surely everyone should see if they haven't seen it already, and the stairs going up to this level of Abbey with the names of the people that went. And it was a great adventure. Well, we brought her in through the locks. We clipped the locks on the way in, by the way, and brought her over on the far side of what I call the sanitary district wall. There were some problems with that. First of all, the Abbey was so big and had such windage that the engineers had some doubt as to whether we could safely moor her on the wall itself. The second problem was that if we were going to pour her on the wall, the sanitary district wanted a fee, a rental. And they wanted a rental that was comparable to the rental they were getting for all the tour boats that are over on Navy Pier, which we couldn't afford. So the negotiations went back again to with the Chicago Park District that could we bring her around into the harbor. A couple of problems with that is first we'd need to hire a towboat, and that was one thing. We would have to build the kind of dolphins we have now so that her weight would be borne by these dolphins, and not the wall. And also we had already built the dock, and the dock Alan had put in at the very north end of the dock, a house which was an engine house for all of the plumbing valves and all the auxiliary things, and that was going to have to go. So that's what we had to do, and that's what we did.
So let's switch to one of the organizations that you got involved with, and that's the Chester Kutner Foundation.
It's Columbia's.
And tell us about that, how you got involved.
When I was Commodore, in my second year, I think, Chester Kutner died, and his then widow, Laverne, wanted there to be a memorial of some sort relating to the sailing community in Chicago, because Chester was a guy who deserved to be remembered. And I said to her, I don't think the club has a slot for that, and I don't want to start negotiating with the Area 3 racing group. So we need a foundation anyway, I think, to encourage and pay for aspects of the junior program. So would you let me form a Columbia Chester Kutner Foundation, the purpose of which would be to reach out to the community and do things like give scholarships to kids who have looked at but never been on Lake Michigan. And they could bring in special teachers to have clinics, to run clinics. We used to run clinics, and we have the people to do it, but it needs money.
Sure.
And so that's what we did, and I recruited every past Commodore that was then alive to be on the board of the foundation. Got a young guy in my firm to set it up, and and persuaded Jerry Thomas to become president.
So it continues on, and Jerry's running it today.
Yes, he is.
That's wonderful. It's a great foundation. Do you have any other words of advice for members? You mentioned earlier about the contributions that so many of your peers had made. What is it? What do you take away from that? What does that mean about our membership?
Well, first of all, when you go back over, as I have done recently, and looked at the board of directors meeting in 1975, when we first knew that bad things were on its way towards us, there were so many solid members. I won't go through and try to name them all,
Sure.
but the Chester Kutner Long Range Planning Committee had a lot of people in it. But one lesson we learned from the whole relocation is that this is a club with an incredible amount of talent within it. There's always somebody whose specialty is something that's needed on the club.
That's true.
And
I think that's true today.
I think so too. I'm sure it is, even though I'm not down here as much as I used to be, but that's it.
Today. Well, we so much appreciate your spending this afternoon today and sharing so many wonderful memories. And hopefully our membership will appreciate and possibly come back to you with emails and questions, because this is a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we had it today, and I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My pleasure.